When we think of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we imagine a nation coming to its moral senses, justice triumphing over hate. But is this really why the Act passed? We think of Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat on the Cleveland Avenue bus, and of Martin Luther King, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, surrounded by tens of thousands of activists, chanting for civil rights reform. But protests don't write laws, politicians do. And people rarely acknowledge the smoky back rooms of Congress that were vital to making the Civil Rights Act a reality. In this presentation, we explore the untold story of the Civil Rights Act. That's not to say the civil rights movement wasn't key to bringing about this change, but instead of representing it as just a moral awakening, we will argue that the strong understanding of power and calculated strategic decisions of American civil rights leaders and politicians was key to the passing of the Civil Rights Act. Firstly, some context. America is a democracy, which creates the political imperative for politicians to listen to the public. Its federalist structure requires any robust reform to go through the House and the Senate. And internationally, the Cold War and African decolonization placed the United States under global scrutiny, as the US claimed to be a beacon of democracy, but ongoing racial injustices at home undermined this image internationally. Economically, America was rife with inequality, as Black Americans faced widespread employment discrimination and low wages. Between the 30s and 60s, America's South experienced decades of industrialization and mechanization, which reduced labor requirements and thus undermined the economic logic of segregation. This accelerated the Great Migration, when between 1940 and 1970, 5 million people, mostly Black Americans, migrated to the North to escape poor economic conditions and racial injustice. Crucially, Black Americans could vote in the North, which increased the political imperative for Northern politicians to back civil rights reform. The social climate was shaped by decades of segregation and racial injustice, but there was a growing moral consciousness towards racial equality. Also, as 90% of Americans were Christian in 1960, the church played a central role in shaping communities and social norms. Technologically, the lead up to the Civil Rights Act was a period of rapid technological advancement, most notably the aforementioned mechanization in the South, but also the television. Approximately 8,000 households in the US had television sets in 1946. Fast forward to 1960, and that number had climbed to over 45 million. This enabled near real-time coverage of civil rights demonstrations and violence against Black Americans to be showed in people's living rooms across the country. Finally, the legal context. Despite protections in the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Black Codes were passed in 1865 in the South to restrict the job and ownership rights of Black people. They laid the foundation for the Jim Crow laws, a later series of laws and customs that enforced racial segregation in the South. However, key legal victories like Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, set a legal precedent for broader civil rights protections. There were even other civil rights acts before 1964. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and of 1960, but these failed to empower the federal government to enforce these changes over states. In sum, the American and international context of the early 1960s created the foundations for the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
This timeline provides the necessary historical context to understand the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The struggle for civil rights in the US began as far back as the American Civil War, which, de jure, abolished slavery in its aftermath. However, this advancement was systematically eroded through the Jim Crow laws, upheld by the 1896 Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson, which legalized segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Throughout the 20th century, civil rights organizations like the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, led efforts to challenge segregation and discrimination. Major turning points included the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954, which overturned segregation in public schools, and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 56, which demonstrated the power of collective action in confronting systemic racism. The Little Rock Nine's integration of public schools in 1957 also highlighted the federal government's role in enforcing desegregation when Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the National Army to escort the students. By the 1960s, activism had intensified, with groups like the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which organized sit-ins and freedom rides to challenge segregation in public spaces. In 1963, the Birmingham campaign drew national attention to the brutal treatment of protesters in images and moving pictures. A key moment came in June 1963, when President John F. Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Bill. Though weak at first, the bill would be influenced by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, a coalition of more than 150 American civil and human rights organizations that had three essential demands. 1, ending discrimination in public accommodations. 2, ensuring equal employment opportunities. And 3, enforcing desegregation in federally funded programs. These three asks made the bill both groundbreaking and controversial, as they weren't included in previous Civil Rights Acts, or were struck down in Congress. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson used his political acumen to reframe the bill as a tribute to JFK, rallying support for its passage. What happened between November and July of the next year will be discussed on a later slide. But this context highlights how decades of legal battles, grassroots activism, and presidential leadership converged to lay the foundation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The stakeholder map provides a visual representation of stakeholders groups categorized into supporters, blockers, and swingers, with distinct colors for different groups. The key supporters on the top right quadrant are the political leaders, President John F. Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, and key Democratic senators like Senator Hubert Humphrey, who was the Senate floor manager for the Civil Rights Act, Senator Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, the Representative Emmanuel Seller, the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, also the civil society and advocacy groups like NAACP, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Congress of Racial Equality Corps, and the Leadership Conference LC. Also influential individuals such as Martin Luther King Jr. from SCLC and Clarence Mitchell from the Leadership Conference. There are also labor unions, national media like Washington Post, New York Times, religious institutions like National Councils of Churches, NCC, pro-individuals, students, Northern and Black Southerners individuals. Also, the key blockers groups consist of Southern senator figures such as Richard Russell, the leader of the Southern Bloc in the Senate, Howard Smith, the chairman of the House Rules Committee, Senator Everett Dirksen, the senator minority leader, and also the organizations like Ku Klux Klan, KKK, or citizens councils. Southern media, Southern business groups, also the swingers group, like indifferent individuals, bipartisan, apolitical, or non-partisan individuals. So to observe, the supporters are clustered with civil rights organization and liberal political leaders in the top right quadrant. The blockers include conservative political figures, Southern media, businesses, and segregationist groups. Neutral and indifferent groups occupy the bottom and center, reflecting the lower influence and mixed or no strong position. So that's how this map provides a strategic overview of the political and societal landscape, identifying allies, opponents, and potential influencers.
Next, we're going to do a power analysis using Gaventa's Power Cube. By exploring how the interplay of power before the act became a reality, we can better understand the systemic and strategic actions that preceded this transmitted legislation. So first, we're going to look at the forms of power. Under visible, of course, we have the President, John F. Kennedy, who commanded the executive branch to propose laws and enforce desegregation orders. As has been mentioned earlier, his commitment was tempered by the need to maintain support from Southern Democrats who strongly opposed civil rights reforms. This duality shaped his cautious public stance on the issue, which was evident in the perceived weak bill which he introduced to Congress. Next, we have Congress. This is the legislative branch. As mentioned, the US system is a federated system, and so the Congress was very powerful in ensuring that laws were passed. And this, particularly the Southern Democratic Coalition, was a major locus of visible power against civil rights progress. Southern legislatures, for example, used their visible authority to block or delay or water down civil rights proposals. They wielded tools like filibusters and procedural rules to maintain segregationist policies in the South. So, for example, the Senate Judiciary Committee was known as the graveyard of civil rights legislation, and this was how they wielded visible power. We also had the courts. The judiciary was another visible actor in shaping civil rights struggle. Decisions like Brown versus Board of Education nationwide struck a significant blow to segregation and set pro-civil rights precedents, but this was not without resistance from Southern segregationists. Next, we look at hidden power, still under the forms of power. We see the Southern legislators and segregationists. Behind closed doors, Southern politicians and elites, including the Dixiecrats, worked to maintain the status quo by controlling committee assignments, influencing the legislative agenda, and aligning with business leaders who supported segregation. These hidden forms of influence ensured that civil rights legislation rarely made it out of the committee and onto the congressional floor. We also had corporate and media allies. Some media outlets and corporations in the South, example, Jackson Daily News, Mississippi and Birmingham News in Alabama, supported segregationist policies. They used their platforms to frame civil rights activists as agitators and to amplify fears of social disruption. Publications like the Civil Citizens Council spread anti-civil rights propaganda, advocating for segregation and opposing civil rights efforts. They spread false news about the provisions of proposed civil rights bill. Next, we look at invisible power, which shapes societal norms and individual beliefs, reinforcing systemic inequality and discouraging resistance. So we see systemic racism. This was deeply embedded in US laws and policies and social practices. It perpetuated segregation, it caused voter suppression and economic inequality, especially in the South. These structures conditioned individuals, Black and white alike, to accept segregation as the norm. It made it difficult to imagine a different reality. Separate but equal facilities for Blacks and whites, segregated schools were examples of how this invisible power came to bear. We also had a long history of internalized oppression, this long history of racial violence, including lynching and legal disenfranchisement, created a climate of fear among Black Americans. This fear often suppressed resistance as individuals prioritized survival over activism. Blacks were afraid to press charges for fear of retaliation. This informed one of the demands of the civil rights activists for the proposed civil rights bills. Now we look at spaces of power to see how the struggle for civil rights took place. We look at closed spaces. These were spaces that were controlled by powerful actors, like congressional committees dominated by segregationist lawmakers or private meetings among Southern elites. These places excluded civil rights advocates, leaving civil rights activists to exert pressure from the outside. Now we look at invited spaces. Occasionally, civil rights leaders were invited into public or political discussions, such as when the NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. met with President Kennedy in June 1963, a few days after the bill was introduced to Congress. We see claimed spaces. When denied access to formal decision-making spaces, civil rights activists created their own, forming coalitions around the country and leveraging one another's strengths and resources. We see the March on Washington, for example, as a powerful claimed space where over 250,000 people gathered to advocate for civil rights, marching from the Washington Monument and culminating at the Lincoln Memorial. This was where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Now we look at levels of power. We see that power operated across different levels, shaping the civil rights struggle in different ways. Globally, The international context of the Cold War heightened the stakes for the US leaders. The United States had positioned itself as a leader of the free world during the Cold War, promoting democracy, liberty, and equality, in contrast to the communist ideologies of the Soviet Union. However, racial segregation, discrimination, and violence against African Americans undermined this message, providing propaganda material for the Soviet Union to highlight the hypocrisy of American democracy. Civil rights activists, with their highly publicized outsider tactics like the Birmingham protest and March on Washington, drew international attention to the racial injustices in the US. Next, we see national. At the national level, institutions like Congress, the presidency, and judiciary were battlegrounds for the civil rights. However, resistance from state governments and law enforcement officials in the South limited federal intervention. The South definitely had more autonomy pre-passing of the CRA on civil rights matters. Local, on the ground, local actors wielded significant power. Sheriffs and police departments often aligned with segregationist policies, using force to suppress protests. We also see local Black leaders, churches, and community groups that became the backbone of the civil rights struggle. These local efforts, such as voter registration drives in the South, laid the groundwork for broader national and global movements. In addition, racist citizens often took matters into their own hands, harassing Black people and enforcing segregationist laws. So, in conclusion, we see that before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, visible, hidden, and invisible power operated in a very complex and interwoven way to uphold segregation and systemic racism. Yet, we also see civil rights activists strategically challenging these power dynamics by claiming spaces and building grassroots movements, eventually forcing the federal government to act. Understanding this pre-passing power landscape highlights the immense barriers to justice and the resilience and strategy to overcome them.
The following slides will examine the diverse tactics and key events that ensured the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It will also contextualize and place on a timeline some of the power relations that we discussed previously. They are organized by outsider driver tactic in green, insider driver tactic in yellow, and blocker tactic in blue. Starting off chronologically is the Birmingham campaign of April to May 1963. Organized by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the campaign used nonviolent protests to confront segregation in one of the most deeply divided cities in America. Images of peaceful protesters being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs horrified the public and heightened calls for federal action. Another critical moment came in early 1963, when Black leaders traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Kennedy. However, instead of meeting the president, they ran into the National Council of Churches, or NCC. While this accidental detour may have seemed like a setback, it instead motivated the NCC to thoroughly support the civil rights movement. This momentum carried forward into the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963, where over 250,000 people gathered to demand civil rights legislation and economic justice. Here, as was previously mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech, galvanizing support for the movement. As was also previously mentioned, President Lyndon B. Johnson framed the bill as a continuation of President Kennedy's legacy after his assassination in November 1963, which we see as being the critical juncture that spurred the passage of the act. President Johnson created moral pressure on lawmakers in Congress, famously instructing them to debate the bill until it passes. Howard Smith, who was the chairman of the House Rules Committee, employed numerous blocker tactics to delay the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. He initially refused to bring the bill to the floor, effectively stalling its progress in the House. During the winter recess of 1963 to 64, civil rights leaders fought back and strategically lobbied constituents in swing districts, urging them to put pressure on their representatives to support the Civil Rights Bill. Howard Smith also attempted to derail the legislation by introducing a controversial amendment that added a prohibition on gender discrimination, hoping it would divide supporters and weaken the bill. However, the leadership of Emanuel Sella ensured that the bill, including all three asks, passed the House and moved to the Senate. In February, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield filed a procedural motion to have the Civil Rights Act discussed by the Senate rather than by the Judiciary Committee, which had killed similar legislation years earlier. Another blocker tactic included the longest Senate filibuster in US history, which lasted 73 days and aimed to prevent the bill from coming to a vote by taking up speaking time. Additionally, segregationist senators proposed numerous amendments designed to weaken or split the bill into smaller, less effective parts, which could then be struck down in subcommittees. At the same time, the Leadership Conference met with legislators twice a week, every Monday and Thursday, to make sure that they were fed correct information and ensured senators were present during votes, which was critical. Hubert Humphrey and Everett Dirksen spearheaded efforts to build a bipartisan coalition. Humphrey, who was the bill's floor manager, worked with Liberal Democrats to advocate for the legislation, while Dirksen persuaded more moderate Republicans to support it. Now, this can't be understated. Dirksen's role was pivotal. His amendments to the bill's language helped secure Republican voters without compromising its core principles, which were the three asks. By creating first movers, the desired snowball effect made it hard for neutral senators to oppose the bill. Together, Humphrey, Dirksen, and Mansfield had split the senators between themselves, and each assured their section would vote in favor of the bill. These bipartisan negotiations ultimately broke the filibuster in June 1964, achieving the necessary two-thirds majority to invoke cloture, which leads the Senate to vote on the resolution as a whole. The bill finally passed the Senate on June 19, 1964. The House reconciled its version with the Senate's amendments, and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2, 1964, in a historic ceremony. This slide emphasizes how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not just a result of legislative prowess, but also the culmination of decades of activism, public pressure, and strategic negotiation. It is a testament to the power of collaboration between social mobilizers and political insiders to enact transformative change.
Moving on to this second stakeholder map, it builds upon the previous map by showing changes in stakeholder support, collaboration, and power influence during this critical phase. There are notable shifts in stakeholder positions. For example, for the key supporters, there are political leaders that we knew earlier. President Johnson takes more prominent position at the top of the more powerful and supportive quadrant, reflecting his leadership role as the new president in advancing the CRA. The pro-CRA senators, such as Humphrey and Dirksen, moved into a more supportive and influential role. And the civil society groups and advocacy leaders like NAACP as CLC Core retained strong support for the CRA, emphasizing the continued advocacy efforts, while Martin Luther King Jr. and labor unions remain significant figures in building public and legislative support. Media outlets like New York Times, Washington Post continue to amplify support, reflecting their role in shaping public opinion. Key blockers, Southern senators and opponents, leaders like Richard Russell, Howard Smith, remain in opposition but are slightly repositioned, reflecting their diminishing influence as momentum for the CRA builds. Groups like KKK and Citizens Councils maintain their opposition with no significant shift in position. Swingers and shifts, for example, Southern business and conservative churches, previously strong blockers, but this group moved slightly toward a neutral and less oppositional stance. It reflects the pressure from public opinion and federal advocacy. While the bipartisan individuals and apolitical individuals, the stakeholders remain in the middle or lower sections of the map, reflecting limited influence or indecision during the phase. To quickly analyze, the map highlights the growing coalition of powerful supporters pushing the CRA towards passage. It also shows the diminishing influence of key blockers such as Southern senators and segregationist groups as public and political pressure mounts. The inclusion of arrows and power shifts underscore the dynamic nature of stakeholder influence during this period, emphasizing strategic alliances and evolving stances.
Next, we look at how power has shifted, given all the activities that we've heard about in the previous slide. So we look at power within. The civil rights activists harnessed the internal strength and growing political awareness of Black Americans. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and organizations like the NAACP inspired confidence and a collective sense of agency. Black political power and influence expanded through voter registration drives, particularly in the South, organized by groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These efforts empowered Black citizens to demand fair representation. The growing public support for civil rights was fueled by national media coverage of events like the Birmingham Campaign in 1963 and the violent crackdown on peaceful protests in Selma, Alabama. There was a sense of personal rights and entitlement growing as activists emphasized the fundamental belief that equality was a moral and constitutional right. This belief motivated individuals to persist despite systemic obstacles. Then we look at power within. We see collaboration between civil rights groups, unions, legislators, and progressive coalitions, which was essential to aligning resources and strategies. For example, key legislative allies like Senator Hubert Humphrey, Senator Everett Dixon were instrumental in creating the Dixon-Humphrey package, a series of compromises that garnered bipartisan support for the CRA. For example, we also see the pre-Senate sitting meetings between civil rights leaders, union representatives, and legislators in the days leading up to the Senate sittings on the CRA, which ensured a unified message and strategy. This collaboration prevented divisions and helped address legislative roadblocks. We see power too. The civil rights leaders, they had the ability to implement powerful tactics, both insider and outsider, which brought the civil rights struggle into the national consciousness and compelled action. The March on Washington we've discussed earlier, led by Martin Luther King Jr., direct action tactics such as sit-ins and freedom rights, letter writing campaigns and lobbying efforts which targeted specific legislators to secure their votes for the CRA. Legal strategies also included lawsuits challenging segregation and discriminatory practices, supported by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Finally, we see power over. The institutional power wielded by President Lyndon B. Johnson and federal entities was pivotal to overcoming the opposition to the Civil Rights Act. President Lyndon B. Johnson employed the Johnson treatment. This was a combination of persuasion, negotiation, and political pressure to convince reluctant lawmakers to support the CRA. The US legislative process, despite opposition from Southern Democrats, enabled the passage of the CRA through strategies like filibuster breaking cloture votes in the Senate. Federal institutions such as the Department of Justice played a critical role in enforcing desegregation orders and supporting the legal aspects of the movement.
Now we'll explore what we believe were the key factors that led to this change. Firstly, economic shifts in Southern industry undermined the economic logic of segregation and promoted a significant migration of Black Americans to northern cities, which increased their power to put pressure on northern politicians to support civil rights reforms. Secondly, the strength of American democratic institutions at the federal level, rooted in the Constitution and common law, played a crucial role because it provided the framework for the protection of civil rights through legislation.
The second factor is the social and moral forces, as the 1960s marked a moral awakening in America, challenging the nation to confront systemic injustices, particularly the racial inequality. Media played a pivotal role, exposing the brutality of this segregation through vivid images and videos. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. strategically timed protests to coincide with the evening news, forcing Americans to witness the moral value of the status quo. Religious institutions were equally vital, serving as moral compasses and organizational hubs. Churches framed civil rights as a moral imperative, turning faith into action and swaying both public opinion and lawmakers. The third factor, grassroots and movement strategy. The civil rights movement's strength came from the grassroots mobilization, turning individual power within into collective power with, and ultimately power to. Leaders like MLK empowered communities, turning individual courage into collective action. And the movement balanced outsider tactics such as marches and sit-ins with insider lobbying, forming relationship with key allies in Congress and White House. This dual approach maintained public pressure while advancing legislative change.
Other factors we see are political and legislative dynamics. So first, we see the legislative prowess, both of the civil rights lobbyists and legislators. So we see skilled legislators like Chairman of the House, Emmanuel Sella, Senator Mansfield, which played a crucial role in ensuring the passage of the CRA. We see tactics like countering filibusters, bypassing the Judiciary Committee, aka the graveyard of the civil rights bills, helped move the bill along. We see supportive members of Congress, such as Senator Hubert Humphrey and Senate Minority Leader Everett Dixon, who used their legislative expertise and knowledge of the Senate rules to push the bill forward. We also see building of coalitions, the Dixon-Humphrey Compromise, which secured bipartisan support. Collaboration between the Democrats and Republicans showcased how cross-party alliances were essential for legislative success. Finally, we see shifting of political support. The District's influence weakened as public support for civil rights grew due to grassroots activism and the visibility of racial injustice. Politicians who recognized the need to act on civil rights or who were first movers took leadership role in breaking political stalemates. Finally, we see international and historical context as being a crucial factor that supported the passing of the CRA. International pressure through international scrutiny on the US during the Cold War, as it claimed to represent democracy and freedom while racial inequality persisted at home. Prominent world leaders and global audiences criticized America's racial discrimination, which contradicted its advocacy of democracy. President John F. Kennedy recognized the international damage caused by racial injustice. In speeches, he reframed the civil rights as essential to America's global leadership and as a matter of national imperative. We also see critical and historical events which also contributed to the passing of the CRA. The assassination of JFK in November 1963 shifted political dynamics. President Lyndon B. Johnson framed the Civil Rights Act as a continuation of Kennedy's legacy, lending the bill moral urgency, but he also took a stronger stance. He used his political skills and personal relationship in Congress to push the bill forward, famously leveraging emotional appeals to secure votes. These are some of the factors that we see as leading to the change and the passing of the CRA.
So, to conclude, the Civil Rights Act emerged as a result of a complex interplay between changes in moral and social norms, public pressure, and political strategy. The context of the United States at the time laid the foundations for federal civil rights reform in the 1960s. The catalyst was JFK's death in 1963, which brought the strength and determination of LBJ as a leader to push a stronger bill through Congress. America underwent a moral and social norm transformation. This was not by chance, but was strategically curated by CSOs and their leaders, who carefully planned their demonstrations and other tactics to maximize impact. The bill wouldn't have been passed without a combination of calculated insider and outsider tactics and coalitions among CSOs and politicians, which bridged grassroots power with legislative power. On the 2nd of July 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, representing an unprecedented victory for civil rights in America.